The courtroom was thick with tension as Judge Williams adjusted his glasses and looked down at the defendant standing before him. Marcus Chun, 22 years old, stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his young face pale but determined. Behind him in the gallery, his father David Chun sat in the front row, his knuckles white as he gripped the wooden bench. The case had drawn media attention from across the state. Marcus had been charged with vehicular manslaughter after an accident that claimed the life of 8-year-old Emma Rodriguez while she was crossing the street with her grandmother. The prosecution argued that Marcus had been texting while driving, running a red light at 35 miles per hour in a school zone. The defense maintained that a mechanical failure in the car's braking system had caused the tragedy. David Chun watched his son's shoulders rise and fall with each breath. This was the boy he had raised alone after his wife died when Marcus was just 12. David had worked double shifts at the manufacturing plant to put Marcus through college, sacrificing his own dreams so his son could have a better life. Marcus had been studying engineering, carrying a 3.8 GPA, with plans to design safer vehicles after graduation. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in that courtroom. The investigation had lasted 8 months. Traffic cameras had captured the accident from 3 different angles. Expert witnesses had testified about brake failure rates and the defendant's phone records. The Rodriguez family sat on the opposite side of the courtroom, Emma's mother clutching a photograph of her daughter in her school uniform, smiling with missing front teeth. Marcus had voluntarily surrendered his license immediately after the accident. He had visited the Rodriguez family twice, against his lawyer's advice, to express his remorse and offer to help with funeral expenses. Mrs. Rodriguez had slammed the door in his face the first time, but during the second visit, she had listened as Marcus broke down on her doorstep, apologizing through tears that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his soul. The trial had revealed disturbing details. Phone records showed Marcus had received a text message 30 seconds before the accident, but expert analysis of the phone's accelerometer data suggested he hadn't been actively typing when the collision occurred. The brake system analysis revealed a manufacturing defect that had been the subject of a quiet recall notice sent to only some vehicle owners. Marcus's family had never received the notice due to a clerical error at the dealership. David remembered the phone call that had changed everything. He had been working late when the hospital called. "Your son has been in an accident," the nurse had said. "He's physically unharmed, but there's been a fatality." David had driven to the hospital in a daze, expecting to find Marcus injured, not to discover that his son was now facing potential prison time. The months following the accident had been a blur of legal meetings, sleepless nights, and a growing pile of bills. David had mortgaged their house to pay for Marcus's defense attorney, Sarah Mitchell, who had taken the case partly because she believed in Marcus's innocence, and partly because she had lost her own brother in a similar accident years earlier. In the courtroom, the prosecution's closing argument had been devastating. District Attorney Robert Harrison painted a picture of a reckless young man whose moment of distraction had destroyed a family. He held up Emma's school photo and spoke about the dreams that would never be fulfilled, the birthdays that would never be celebrated, the graduation that would never happen. The defense's closing statement focused on the mechanical evidence. Sarah Mitchell had brought in automotive engineers who testified that the brake defect could have caused a delay of up to 3 seconds in stopping time. In a vehicle traveling at 35 miles per hour, those 3 seconds represented the difference between stopping safely and a fatal collision. Marcus had insisted on testifying in his own defense, despite his lawyer's concerns. He had spoken quietly about the moment of the accident, how he had seen Emma step into the crosswalk, and had immediately pressed the brake pedal. He described the horrible sensation of the pedal going soft under his foot, the panic as he realized the car wasn't stopping as it should. He had swerved to try to avoid her, but the laws of physics had worked against them both. The jury had deliberated for 18 hours across 3 days. During that time, David had barely slept or eaten. He had sat in the courthouse cafeteria, drinking bitter coffee and watching the Rodriguez family maintain their vigil on the other side of the room. On the second day of deliberations, Emma's grandfather had approached David and sat down across from him without saying a word. They had sat in silence for nearly an hour before the older man had spoken. "I have a grandson about your son's age," he had said simply. "This whole thing is just impossible." The media had been relentless throughout the trial. Television crews had camped outside the courthouse, and reporters had approached family members from both sides. The case had become a symbol in the ongoing debate about distracted driving, automotive safety regulations, and corporate responsibility. Social media had been particularly brutal, with keyboard warriors taking sides based on incomplete information and personal prejudices. David had tried to shield Marcus from most of the coverage, but it was impossible to avoid completely. The stress had taken its toll on both of them. Marcus had lost 20 pounds and had developed dark circles under his eyes that made him look years older. David had started taking blood pressure medication for the first time in his life. As the jury filed back into the courtroom for the final time, David studied their faces for any hint of what they had decided. The foreman, a middle-aged woman who worked as a high school principal, avoided eye contact with everyone in the room. David's heart sank. He had read enough about trials to know that jurors who had voted to convict often couldn't look at the defendant's family. Judge Williams called the court to order and asked the jury if they had reached a verdict. The foreman stood and confirmed that they had. The court clerk took the folded paper and handed it to the judge, who read it silently before handing it back. Marcus remained standing as the judge prepared to read the verdict. David could see his son's hands trembling slightly, the only outward sign of the terror that must have been coursing through him. Sarah Mitchell placed a supportive hand on Marcus's shoulder. The charges had been serious enough to carry a maximum sentence of 15 years in prison. Even a conviction on a lesser charge could mean several years behind bars and a permanent felony record that would destroy Marcus's dreams of becoming an engineer. David had already prepared himself for the possibility of visiting his son in prison, of watching the young man's future crumble because of a few terrible seconds on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. The Rodriguez family leaned forward in their seats. Emma's mother clutched her husband's hand, her knuckles as white as David's had been. They had attended every day of the trial, listening to testimony that forced them to relive the worst moment of their lives repeatedly. David couldn't imagine their pain, but he also couldn't help but love his son and hope for his freedom. Judge Williams looked down at Marcus and began to speak. The words seemed to echo in the silent courtroom, each syllable carrying the weight of two families' futures. On the charge of vehicular manslaughter in the first degree, Judge Williams announced, his voice cutting through the absolute silence of the courtroom, "We, the jury, find the defendant not guilty." The words hit the room like a physical force. David felt his knees buckle as relief flooded through him. But before he could fully process what he had heard, the judge continued. "On the charge of vehicular manslaughter in the second degree, we, the jury, find the defendant not guilty." Another wave of gasps rippled through the courtroom. David's heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. However, Judge Williams continued, and David's brief moment of relief evaporated. "On the charge of negligent vehicular homicide, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty." The word guilty seemed to hang in the air. David felt the world tilt around him. Marcus swayed slightly, but remained standing. Behind them, someone in the Rodriguez family let out a sob that sounded like both grief and relief mixed together. Judge Williams set down the verdict and looked directly at Marcus. "The court will reconvene in 2 weeks for sentencing. Until that time, the defendant will remain free on the existing bail arrangement." He banged his gavel once, and suddenly, the courtroom erupted in noise. Reporters rushed toward the exit, phones already pressed to their ears. The Rodriguez family hugged each other, tears streaming down their faces. David sat frozen in his seat, trying to understand what had just happened. Guilty, but not of the worst charges. It was a partial victory that felt like a complete defeat. Marcus turned around slowly, his face pale, but strangely calm. "Dad," he said softly, "it's going to be okay." David stood up on unsteady legs and embraced his son, not caring that cameras were probably capturing the moment. Sarah Mitchell quickly explained that the conviction on the lesser charge typically carried a sentence of 18 months to 4 years, depending on various factors. There was also the possibility of probation, community service, and other alternatives to prison time. The partial acquittal on the more serious charges had been a significant victory, she assured them, though David struggled to feel victorious about anything. Outside the courthouse, the scene was chaotic. News crews had set up a gauntlet that the families would have to navigate to reach their cars. Sarah Mitchell advised them to say nothing to reporters, but as they walked through the crowd, questions were shouted from all directions. "Marcus, do you feel justice was served? Mr. Chun, what's your reaction to the verdict? Will you appeal the conviction?" David kept his arm around his son's shoulders and pushed through the crowd without responding. Behind them, he could hear the Rodriguez family's attorney making a brief statement about their satisfaction that Marcus had been held accountable, while expressing disappointment that he hadn't been convicted on the more serious charges. The drive home was mostly silent. Marcus stared out the passenger window at the familiar streets of their neighborhood, perhaps wondering how many more times he would see them as a free man. David tried to think of something comforting to say, but everything that came to mind sounded hollow. Their house looked exactly the same as when they had left it that morning, but everything felt different now. David had imagined this moment many times over the past months, sometimes envisioning a complete acquittal and celebration, other times preparing for the worst-case scenario. The reality of a mixed verdict had somehow been harder to prepare for. Marcus went directly to his room and closed the door. David stood in the kitchen, unsure what to do next. The refrigerator hummed quietly, and he could hear the neighbor's dog barking in the backyard. Normal sound from a world that no longer felt normal. The phone started ringing almost immediately. Friends, family members, reporters who had somehow obtained their number. David turned off the ringer and let the calls go to voicemail. He wasn't ready to talk to anyone yet. That evening, Marcus emerged from his room and found David sitting at the kitchen table, staring at a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours earlier. They ordered pizza, though neither of them had much appetite. As they ate, they talked carefully around the obvious subjects, discussing mundane things like whether the lawn needed cutting and whether David should call in sick to work the next day. Finally, Marcus set down his slice of pizza and looked directly at his father. "I keep thinking about her," he said quietly. "Emma. Her family got some justice today, but she's still gone. Nothing changes that." David nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Throughout the trial, he had been focused primarily on protecting his son, but he had never stopped thinking about the little girl whose life had ended so suddenly and senselessly. The following days brought a strange new routine. Marcus was required to check in with his probation officer twice a week while awaiting sentencing. He had been forbidden from driving, so David took time off work to drive him to these appointments and to meetings with Sarah Mitchell as they prepared for the sentencing hearing. During this time, something unexpected happened. Emma's grandmother, Maria Rodriguez, contacted Sarah Mitchell and asked if it would be possible to meet with Marcus and David privately. The lawyer was surprised by the request, but arranged for a meeting at her office. Maria Rodriguez was a small woman in her 70s who moved slowly but carried herself with obvious dignity. She had been holding Emma's hand when the accident occurred and had been the primary witness for the prosecution. Seeing her in person, outside the formal setting of the courtroom, was intensely emotional for both David and Marcus. "I wanted to look at you," she told Marcus directly, speaking with a slight Spanish accent. "In the courtroom, you were just the person who hurt our family. But you were someone's son too. Someone's whole world." Marcus struggled to maintain his composure as she continued. "I don't forgive you. I'm not ready for that, and maybe I never will be. But I could see that you were suffering too. Emma wouldn't want anyone to suffer because of her, even the person who caused her death." The meeting lasted only 20 minutes, but it changed something for everyone involved. Maria Rodriguez didn't excuse what had happened, but she acknowledged Marcus's humanity in a way that the formal legal process couldn't address. Word of the meeting somehow reached the media, and suddenly there were new stories about forgiveness and healing. Some people praised Maria Rodriguez for her grace, while others criticized her for meeting with the person who had killed her granddaughter. The family received both supportive and angry messages from strangers around the country. 2 weeks after the verdict, David and Marcus returned to the courthouse for sentencing. The building looked the same, but David felt like there were different people walking through those doors. The uncertainty was almost over, for better or worse. The courtroom was less crowded this time, though the Rodriguez family was there again, sitting in their usual seats. Several character witnesses had come to speak on Marcus's behalf, including 2 of his professors, his former boss from his summer internship, and Mrs. Patterson, the elderly neighbor he had helped after she fell on the ice the previous winter. Judge Williams had clearly given careful thought to the sentencing decision. He spoke about the complexity of the case, the technical evidence regarding the brake defect, Marcus's lack of prior criminal history, and his apparent genuine remorse. He also acknowledged the devastating loss suffered by the Rodriguez family and the need for accountability. This court finds that while the defendant bears responsibility for the death of Emma Rodriguez, the judge said, the circumstances suggest that this tragedy resulted from a combination of factors, including mechanical defect that should have been addressed by the vehicle manufacturer. David held his breath as the judge continued. Therefore, this court sentences the defendant to 2 years in state prison, with the possibility of parole after 18 months, suspended pending completion of 4 years of supervised probation, 800 hours of community service focused on traffic safety education, and a permanent revocation of driving privileges. Marcus would not be going to prison, provided he successfully completed his probation. David felt his legs give out slightly, and he grabbed the back of the bench to steady himself. His son would come home with him that day. But as Judge Williams prepared to adjourn the court, something completely unexpected happened. David Chun, who had remained silent throughout the entire legal process, suddenly stood up in the gallery. "Your Honor," David's voice rang out across the courtroom, surprising everyone, including his son. "I need to say something." Judge Williams paused, his gavel halfway to the bench. "Mr. Chun, this is highly irregular. The sentencing has been completed. Please," David continued, his voice gaining strength. "There's something this court needs to know. Something that changes everything." Marcus turned around in shock, staring at his father. Sarah Mitchell looked confused, glancing between David and her client. The Rodriguez family leaned forward in their seats, uncertain what was happening. Judge Williams studied David's face for a long moment. Something in the older man's expression must have convinced him, because he set down his gavel and said, "Approach the bench, Mr. Chun." David walked forward on unsteady legs, very aware that every eye in the courtroom was focused on him. When he reached the judge's bench, he spoke in a voice that was quiet but carried clearly in the silent room. "Your Honor, the brake defect wasn't the only mechanical problem with that car. There was something else, something I never told anyone because I was trying to protect my son. But I can't let him live with this burden anymore." The courtroom was so quiet that David could hear the court reporter's fingers on the keyboard and the distant sound of traffic outside. Judge Williams leaned forward slightly. "What are you saying, Mr. Chun?" David's hands were shaking now, but his voice remained steady. The steering system had been acting up for about a month before the accident. The car would pull to the left sometimes, especially when braking hard. I knew it needed to be fixed, but money was tight, and I kept putting it off. I told myself it wasn't dangerous, that we could wait until after Marcus graduated and got a job. The words seemed to pour out of him now, months of guilt and secret knowledge finally finding their way into the light. The morning of the accident, Marcus mentioned that the steering felt funny when he took the car to campus. I told him it was probably nothing, that he should just drive carefully. I sent my son out in a car that I knew had problems, and because of that decision, a little girl is dead. Marcus stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. No. Stop talking. Please stop." But David continued, tears now streaming down his face. "I've listened to my son blame himself for 8 months. I've watched him lose weight and have nightmares and prepare to go to prison for something that was as much my fault as his. The brake failure might have caused the accident, but the steering problem made it impossible for him to avoid Emma once the car started sliding. I should have fixed that car. I should have kept him from driving it. If I had done what a good father should do, Emma Rodriguez would be alive today. The courtroom erupted. Marcus was saying no, no, no repeatedly, while Sarah Mitchell tried to approach the bench. From the gallery, someone in the Rodriguez family cried out. Judge Williams banged his gavel several times, trying to restore order. When the noise died down, the judge looked at David with a mixture of surprise and something that might have been respect. Mr. Chun, are you aware that you are potentially incriminating yourself in open court? You have the right to remain silent and to consult with an attorney. I don't want a lawyer, David replied firmly. I want my son to understand that this wasn't all his fault. I want the Rodriguez family to know the full truth about what happened to their granddaughter. And I want to face the consequences of my own choices. Marcus had pushed past the railing and was now standing next to his father. Dad, you don't understand. The steering problem didn't cause the accident. I've known about it for weeks. I was being extra careful because of it. When the brakes failed, I tried to steer around Emma, but the car was going too fast. The steering problem didn't matter. David turned to his son with surprise. But you said the car felt funny that morning. It always felt funny, Marcus said, his voice breaking. That's why I was driving so slowly, why I was being so careful. The steering issue made me a more cautious driver, not a more dangerous one. Sarah Mitchell had finally reached the bench and was frantically whispering to Judge Williams. The prosecutor was huddled with his assistants, looking confused and uncertain. The court reporter had stopped typing and was staring at the scene unfolding before her. Judge Williams called a recess and ordered everyone except the immediate families and attorneys to leave the courtroom. As the reporters and spectators filed out, he asked David and Marcus to remain at the bench. Mr. Chun, the judge said to David, I appreciate your desire to protect your son, but what you've described doesn't change the facts of this case. The jury heard extensive testimony about all mechanical issues with the vehicle. The steering problem you mentioned was actually included in the defense's expert witness testimony, though it wasn't emphasized because the evidence showed it wasn't a contributing factor to the accident. David looked stunned. But I thought. You thought you were carrying some terrible secret, Marcus said gently. But, Dad, I told my lawyer about the steering issue months ago. It was all part of the case. Judge Williams nodded. The mechanical inspection of the vehicle was thorough, Mr. Chun. Your son's legal team did their job properly. The steering issue was documented, but the evidence clearly showed that the brake failure was the primary mechanical cause of the accident. David sat down heavily in the nearest chair, looking lost and confused. For months, he had been carrying the weight of what he believed was his own contribution to the tragedy. The guilt had eaten away at him, making him feel responsible not just for his son's suffering, but for Emma's death as well. Marcus knelt beside his father's chair. Dad, you've been blaming yourself all this time for something that wasn't your fault. Just like you've been watching me blame myself for something that wasn't entirely my fault either. The Rodriguez family had remained in the courtroom during the recess. Emma's mother approached the bench slowly, her face wet with tears. When she reached David and Marcus, she stood there for a moment, looking at both of them. I heard what you just did, she said to David. You were willing to go to prison to protect your son from guilt that was eating you both alive. She paused, wiping her eyes. Emma's father and I have been so focused on our anger and our grief that we forgot something important. This whole thing destroyed your family too. David looked up at her, hardly able to believe she was addressing him directly. Mrs. Rodriguez, I'm so sorry about your daughter. I know that nothing I say or do can bring her back or take away your pain. No, it can't, she agreed. But what you just did in this courtroom, that took courage. And it showed me that you and your son have been suffering too in ways I hadn't really thought about. Judge Williams had been watching this exchange with obvious emotion. When Mrs. Rodriguez finished speaking, he cleared his throat. This court has witnessed something extraordinary today. While Mr. Chin's revelation doesn't change the legal facts of this case, it demonstrates the complex nature of tragedy and responsibility. He looked directly at Marcus. Young man, your sentence stands as originally pronounced. You will serve 4 years of supervised probation and complete your community service requirements. But I want you to understand something important. The guilt you've been carrying, the guilt your father has been carrying, is a normal human response to being involved in a tragedy. It doesn't necessarily reflect actual legal or moral responsibility. The judge then addressed the courtroom more broadly. This case has been about more than just assigning blame for a tragic accident. It's been about a community trying to make sense of senseless loss, about families trying to find a way forward after an event that changed everything for everyone involved. As the formal proceedings concluded, something unprecedented happened. The Rodriguez family and the Chun family found themselves standing together in the hallway outside the courtroom. Emma's grandfather, who had sat silently through most of the trial, was the first to speak. My granddaughter was a kind child, he said simply. She wouldn't want any of this anger to continue forever. She would want us all to find a way to heal. David nodded, unable to speak. Marcus stepped forward and addressed Emma's family directly. I will never stop being sorry for what happened. And I will spend the rest of my life trying to honor Emma's memory by working to prevent other accidents like this one. Mrs. Rodriguez looked at Marcus for a long time before responding. That little girl loved engineering shows on television. She was always building things with blocks and asking how cars worked and why bridges didn't fall down. Maybe there's a way for your engineering degree to be part of keeping other children safe. The two families didn't embrace or suddenly become friends. The pain was still too raw, the loss too profound for that kind of resolution. But something had shifted in that courthouse hallway. The absolute separation between them had softened into something more complex and more human. Outside the courthouse, the media was waiting for statement from both families. For the first time since the accident, David and Marcus approached the microphones together. Marcus spoke briefly about his commitment to traffic safety advocacy and his gratitude for the opportunity to serve his sentence through community service rather than imprisonment. But it was David's statement that would be remembered and replayed on news broadcasts for weeks to come. Today I learned something about the difference between guilt and responsibility, he said. My son and I have both been carrying guilt that was larger than our actual responsibility. That doesn't minimize the tragedy of Emma Rodriguez's death or excuse the choices that led to the accident. But it reminds us that healing requires both accountability and forgiveness, including forgiving ourselves for being imperfect human beings in an imperfect world. As they drove home together that afternoon, David and Marcus were quiet for most of the trip. Finally, Marcus spoke. Dad, what you did in there. I've never had anyone love me enough to be willing to go to prison for me. David reached over and briefly clasped his son's hand. Son, I would do anything to protect you. But what I learned today is that sometimes protection means helping someone face the truth, not hiding from it. The work of healing would continue for both families. Marcus would spend the next 4 years in community service, speaking at high schools about traffic safety and working with automotive engineers on improved brake system designs. The Rodriguez family would establish a foundation in Emma's memory to promote pedestrian safety in school zones. And David would learn, slowly and with difficulty, to distinguish between the guilt that serves justice and the guilt that serves only to punish. The moment in that courtroom when he thought he was confessing to a crime had actually been the moment he began to forgive himself for being human.